Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our talk. We're going to be talking about Rust and the approach to open source that we've been kind of discovering and experimenting with over the years. So I'm Nico Matsakis, and this is Aaron Turan. Here's some outdated pictures of us, or at least of me, from GitHub. But one of the things, when the Rust project started, it was originally and always envisioned as an open project, right? But the definition of open is kind of a little up in the air, and the reasons to be open are maybe not entirely obvious, right? I mean, I think for us here at Mozilla, it's kind of clear that we should be open because that's what we do, and it's part of who we are. But I think there's also a very practical benefit to developing, especially a programming language, but really any project probably in the open. I mean, for Rust, it means that we get to have the input from as wide a variety of people as possible, and also that we have a better chance of getting a lot of people using Rust, which then means that if we use Rust in Mozilla, then they're able to contribute and help us with patches and whatever else. Right? But one of the things we found is that open is also just harder than you might expect. And there's a lot of unexpected, at least for me, things that arose over time and that we had to adjust and change our strategy. One of the things that we've been progressively trying hard to do, with Rust especially, is to push the open approach to as many aspects of running the project as we can. Do as many things in as wide and community-oriented a way as possible. And so it started out, I think the most obvious things are like discussing the design over a mailing list or in public, hacking on the compiler, having PRs on tools and other things, and maybe library development. But you can go way past that. There's lots of stuff that we are now running kind of in the open and in a community-oriented way, right? So things like running our infrastructure and our release process, website maintenance, and also things like organizing of meetups and conferences, and the list goes on, right? And this didn't happen all at once. And the way that we ran the Rust project has evolved a lot over the years. So in the very beginning, I think like when I started was 2011, we kind of had a core nucleus of 4 or 5 employees, and we had this mailing list where we would talk about stuff most of the time. And we had these work weeks where the employees would get together and hack on stuff. And sometimes, and there were also PRs coming from the outside, but I think a lot of the work was really driven, both design and implementation, by the employees. And one of the things that happened is even amongst ourselves, we were distributed over different geographic locations. Most of us were in Mountain View, but there was Graydon in Vancouver and Marine over in Berlin. And there started to be sometimes, I would say, there would be tensions that arise because the people in Mountain View maybe would like come up with a design on their own, and it wouldn't be properly communicated over the mailing list or elsewhere. And so then other people, if you weren't there locally, you didn't kind of come along on the process. And so that just kind of, if you try to scale, that's already a problem with, like, say, 5 or 6 people. If you try to scale that up to the whole internet, you can imagine that it starts to fracture. One of the specific things we had that we found was sometimes problematic is that we would get PRs aiming to change the language, so pull requests. Basically, people would go and implement a feature that they wanted, and it wasn't necessarily a feature that we thought would be good for Rust as a whole, right? It wasn't necessarily following a coherent design. And these people might come from the community, or sometimes it might be just one of us kind of going off on their own, right? This could happen. And so around the 1.0 timeframe, we made a big change. One of the sort of very consequential change, where we introduced this Rfc process, which is basically, if you want to make a big change to Rust, there was a formal way to where to post it, and how to get feedback and make a decision on whether to embark on that change or not. Before, RFCs were something we did, but it was much less formal. You would just send a thing to the mailing list. And this was a great success. We no longer got these random PRs. But we did have this problem that now we started to get kind of random RFCs, and people making proposals that were all over the place and didn't necessarily have a coherent theme. And it was hard to keep up with all the RFCs, too. So we moved over time to more and more of a process. For example, we introduced Rust teams, which are essentially growing the leadership tremendously so that we can keep up with more RFCs and we can have more input, going way beyond employees to just people who have been working in the project for a long time and had kind of accumulated a lot of wisdom. And we introduced things like final comment periods. We'll talk about some of the details here later. But I think in terms of the random RFC problem, one of the big things we did was move to introduce a roadmap, which is essentially a special RFC at the beginning of the year that kind of sets the agenda and lets the community decide what are our priorities going to be going forward, and then helps us to decide on the other RFCs and things that come up during the year. And it's not the end, right? This is what we've been doing so far. I expect we're going to keep changing and tweaking our process and our procedures. But you can see, this is a graph of the number of people on the Rust governance teams starting when they first were established and going to the present day. And you can see the effects of all these changes. Each time we kind of improve the way that we interact with the community, the teams grow bigger and bigger and more. Essentially, the number of participants is leaping, and we're really happy with that. We're very proud of it. And I think it's pretty interesting to see this comes up to over 100 here. And there are 7 employees included in that list, and the rest come from the outside, right? So that's pretty great. So that's kind of the intro. From here, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron, and he's going to talk about this first 2 sections of why wasn't I consulted and articulate the vision. So each of these sections is kind of a little catchphrase that we've come up with that kind of summarizes some of the lessons that we've learned. And then I'll talk about the path to leadership, and we'll finish up. So here you go, Aaron.
Cool. Thanks, Nico. Yeah, so the structure of the rest of the talk is basically going back through the timeline that Nico just outlined and digging into some of the formative stories and ideas that we pulled out of them that now constitute part of Rust's governance. So the first lesson that we learned happened in the run-up to Rust 1.0, around the time that we were starting to play with this RFC process. And I think I joined the project right at the cusp of this change. So I joined about a year before 1.0, and my job was to essentially get the standard library ready for 1.0. And just to give you a little bit of the context here, because of the policy up to that point of just these random PRs, the standard library had just kind of accreted over time. Like, there were definitely a lot of good things about it, but there was a lot of inconsistencies, and it wasn't clear that we wanted everything that was there. But with 1.0, we were going to start making promises that, okay, we're committing to these APIs. So a big part of my job was developing a process where the community could come together and actually make these final decisions about what would ship. And I made some missteps in the beginning of that. So this particular story, one of the first sort of interesting community experiences I had, we had developed the beginnings of this library process and went through it for certain APIs. And if you've used Rust, you've probably heard of unwrap. And we were proposing to rename it to assert. You probably have opinions about this if you use Rust. And so we followed this process that we had laid out, and I made a pull request. And then I started getting all these interesting comments on the pull request, basically saying, wait a second, like, you're renaming this fundamental thing. When did this happen? And also, you're pointing to these guidelines over here that are justifying this change, but you wrote those and committed those too. Like, what's going on? Being my, at the time, very naive self, I was saying, well, we had a process. As a community, we decided we were going to do this thing, and we had a meeting. And in the meeting, we talked about all the points that people were making on this thread, and we came to this decision, and then you can guess what happened, right? So if you've spent any time on the internet, in any kind of comment forums, you will have seen the kind of explosion that can happen with this kind of course of events. So older, wiser Nico stepped in and saved my butt, and basically after 80 comments on this thread, said, all right, we hear you. We understand that people didn't feel like they had sufficient input, so we're going to go back to the drawing board and use a sort of more broadcast process with this request for comments, where it's very clear, like, okay, this is under discussion now. Here is the place to state your opinion and weigh in, and we'll reach a decision there. And it was fascinating. If you look back at this thread, the moment that Nico said that, all of these people who had been complaining, were first of all grateful, but also expressed like a sense of trust in the Rust process. And that's a recurring theme as we go through things here. So of course I can't let Nico come off looking like the good guy here. So fast forward a bit to now just a few months before 1.0. And by this time, we had gone through the vast majority of the standard library. We had gotten pretty good at this process and other parts of the language too. But there are a lot of details to get nailed down before shipping. So there was this one particular issue of what we called certain integer types. And the details don't really matter. But it was something the leadership of Rust knew this was a hotly debated topic. There was a GitHub thread with a couple hundred comments about it over the course of a couple years. And we just didn't think it was a big deal. But we knew that we needed to make a decision. And so we were doing our due diligence, and we read the thread, and we had conversations, and again, a meeting. And then Nico wrote this long and beautiful blog post that contained some very important little phrases like, "We've come to a final decision," right? And this post just came out of the blue as far as the community was concerned, right? There was this whole thread, and then leadership steps in and says, "We've read your thread over here, and we believe we've come to a decision now." And same story, massive explosion. And I'm forever indebted to a member of the Rust community, Gabor, who has consistently held our feet to the fire. But Gabor, there was a pivotal moment in this story where he really articulated the problem with how things were progressing. And it's basically that we have this two-level system of discussion. There's the community. You all can talk over here in this thread. But then the leadership that's actually going to make decisions, they don't have to make the arguments beforehand in this thread. They can kind of swoop in and just hand them down. And that didn't feel right to people. And indeed, I think it leads to worse outcomes, right? So Yehuda here was the savior in this case. And basically, same story. We step back. We say, we're going to go back to the drawing board, go through an RFC process, and participate fully front to back. And in both of these stories, the ultimate decision that shipped in 1.0 was the opposite of what the leadership team was proposing at first. And that's not just because we were trying to please the community. Like, we actually worked through the debate and came to agree. So those are sort of some background stories, and I'm sure you've seen similar stories play out in communities you've been involved in. There's a great essay called "The Web is a Customer Service Medium" by Paul Ford. And part of the idea of this essay is that as a kind of media, the thing that the web is uniquely good at is answering the question, why wasn't I consulted? Okay, like when people get really passionate about the internet, it tends to be around these kinds of open forums, fandoms, communities where there's a sense of empowerment that you actually have a voice, you can actually have influence. And you can see this in a few lights. On the one hand, it's amazing to get such a diversity of input, and we'll talk later about how much that can help. On the other hand, I think there is sometimes a sense of almost entitlement that, well, my opinion that I came up with in 5 minutes matters as much as these people who have been thinking about it for weeks, right? So it's a tough balance. But for better or worse, I think this is indeed a fundamental part of life online and life in the open. And so any open source project has to grapple with this problem. So in the Rust world, we've already sort of started talking about the ways that we tackle consultation. So the big idea is the request for comment process. And there's been an arc over time where more and more kinds of decisions come under the RFC process. So, it started just for core language features, then included library things, and now we use it for talking about, what web browsers Crates.io should support, or community events even, or all kinds of things. Anything is fair game anytime we need to make a decision together. And so the goal is you're inviting input from the whole world, which is very chaotic and hard to structure well. But we have these teams that are the ultimate decision makers in each of these areas, and part of their responsibility is to help guide the discussion productively. And so the goal is not that everybody's opinion necessarily gets the same weight. It's not like a voting democracy kind of thing. It's more that we're collectively exploring a space of trade-offs. And it really is just incredible how you can consider yourself a deep expert in an area, and some rando on the internet can show up and surprise you with a point that you never would have considered, right? So the process is, first of all, this exploration of what are the options, what are the trade-offs, and then at some point that reaches more or less a steady state. And that doesn't mean that everybody involved in the thread has reached the same consensus. In fact, that usually doesn't happen. But at least we agree on the contours of the decision. And at that point, then, the team will sort of start to head toward a decision, propose to move a certain direction, either accepting or rejecting the RFC. And then, as Nico mentioned, there's a final comment period, one last advertisement to make sure we don't cause any why wasn't I consulted problems. And then a key lesson with all of this, and this is coming from those earlier stories, especially the great int debate, is that when the team does finally make a decision, that decision has to be based on argument that already played out on the thread. You can't simultaneously make a decision and be making brand new arguments that nobody's had a chance to respond to. So at this point, this stuff feels pretty basic, I think, to the Rust community. Like we've been operating in this way for 3 years now, but it was hard to get there. And I think there are a lot of trade-offs here. It's really tiring to deal with the droves of people coming in, and it can be really slow. But this is how we do it. And I want to contrast that with there are lots of other schools of thought around how to do open source. And I certainly am not claiming that the Rust way is the only way or even the best way. I think it works well for what we're trying to do. But to try to draw this contrast explicitly, so the Apache Software Foundation has a lot of guidance around how to run open source projects. And they talk in explicit terms about doing something very unlike what we're doing in Rust, where basically you contribute just by you write some code. You think you have an idea, you think you know what the community wants, you write some code, and if nobody sees the code and it lands, congratulations. Like, nobody objected, it's fine. And the rationale, if you read these documents, they say, it's all under source control. So, if people get upset later, you can back it out. Like I say, this may work for some communities, but we could never get away with this in Rust, nor would we want to. And so, in some sense, the Rfc process is the diametric opposite of this. It's eager consensus around all major decisions, and it's a lot of work. But I think for Rust, we're really, we're looking for the long term. We're wanting to get these things right, and so we're willing to pay these costs. So that was the lead up to 1.0 and some of those basic lessons. But we had a lot more to learn even after we shipped the first version of Rust. And I think a big part of what we had to learn was how to effectively herd cats. And of course, this is a common meme in open source, and it ties back with people sending random PRs and RFCs and so on. But I distinctly remember in the months after 1.0, this feeling of what's next? Like, as a community, we had enormous energy around shipping 1.0 as a clear goal, and then after we did it, there were so many things we could work on, and it was really unclear what should happen. And the community felt this as well. This is just a tiny smattering of posts that were going around at this time. And I love these posts. This is very typical, right? Somebody comes in and they're like, why is this entire project not focused on my #1 priority? I don't understand. And of course, then there are posts of the same type arguing for a completely different priority. And it was kind of a mess. So I'm going to pick on Nico again. So recognizing this, we thought, well, as the leadership team, we have a better perspective on all of this. So clearly, we can write one of these posts, and that'll fix it, right? And indeed, we did see a bigger picture than most of the other people that were complaining, but that was kind of the problem. So this ended up just being a really long laundry list, and I don't want to pick on Nico too much here in the sense that virtually everything on this list has actually been a priority over these last 3 years. Many of them are completed, many of them are still underway. So at a technical level, we weren't wrong, but this was not an effective way to herd cats. Right, and so here I want to draw out another contrast with conventional wisdom in open source. And I think there is a lot of wisdom here that when you're talking about volunteers, dedicating time on a project, they're doing so because there's some passion, there's some connection. And so you have to sort of work with that intrinsic motivation, right? You can't tell them what to do. But I think you don't have to be fatalistic about this. This doesn't mean you just have to accept that people are going to come in with random stuff and you got to figure out how to plug it in. We try to sort of thread the needle, I guess, between having a clear direction and vision, but still being inclusive to everybody's individual motivations. And so that comes down to this idea of articulating the vision. And in a way, this is a counterpoint to the RFC process, right? So we have this open consultation, and we focused a lot on how the final decision is made and the role that the leaders play there at the very end, basically. But there's also a really important role for leaders to play much earlier in the process, before RFCs are even being written. And that is articulating a vision, right, or thought leadership. And this takes a huge variety of shapes. So sometimes it's writing a blog post that's talking about a way of thinking about certain classes of design problems. You write that post, and then you see echoes of that in RFC threads later, like you've actually communicated a design approach. Or sometimes these are inspirational things or aspirational, and you're saying, Rust should look like this. And it's not always forward-looking. And a lot of times what happens is we've done a lot of work together, and only in hindsight do we understand what that work actually added up to be and what the values were. And it's still really important for leaders to pinpoint that and communicate it back to the community, and that becomes part of the sort of axioms by which the community operates. So, and again, this is in contrast to show me the code, this approach of everybody should just write code. That's all that matters. So to make this a little more concrete, and we started doing this around 1.0, where we had a whole bunch of blog posts that had this shape X without Y. And there's a lot of reasons that works well for Rust. But these were pithy slogans that captured big chunks of what Rust was about in a way that people could, that resonated with people, that was simple to understand, that we could all sort of come together around. And that would get us roughly pointed in a common direction, so that we were just working out the details rather than everybody writing these posts about going off in completely different directions. And then more recently, in 2017, we had a slogan on the roadmap, fast, reliable, productive, pick 3. The idea being fast and reliable were like the themes of 1.0, and now we want to add productivity, right? And so you compare that kind of slogan to this miles-long post that we started out with after 1.0, and I think this is just far more effective. And so Nico already mentioned, it was a nice post. Nico already mentioned the roadmap process, and that's the way that we've formalized this idea. So, there's a lot of vision articulation that happens separately from this, but we come together each year as a community and set out some high-level slogans, basically, some really product-focused end goals that we want for a given year. And that sets the stage for the RFC process throughout the rest of the year. And so the idea is, if you're effective at inspiring people this way, then they will naturally have sort of itches to scratch that fall along these same dimensions. And if they don't, you have a much easier time saying no or not yet, right? That this proposal makes sense, but it's not part of our 2018 focus. And that's a really hard thing in open source. If you have a huge community, how do you actually stay focused? You only have so much design bandwidth. You can't take everything. And we use the RFC process itself to determine the roadmap. And there's one more sort of aspect to all of this that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is, there's this tension, right, that on the one hand, we want a highly inclusive, diverse community and to reach a variety of audiences. That fundamentally means not everybody's going to have the same values or interpretations of shared values. But at the same time, it's really important that the product, at the end of the day, has a clear and coherent vision, right? And so balancing between those two things is pretty tricky. And the idea is, the way we handle this is basically by having the teams that are, informally articulating the vision, and then formally at the end of the process making decisions. And their responsibility is both to take into account all of the diversity of ideas that we're seeing on these threads, but then condense them down to an actual coherent product vision in the end. It's a tall order, and we mess up a lot, but that's the goal. And with that.
So I just want to add one thing about articulating the vision before I go into this. One of the ways that, or one of the aspects of it for me that I see is that in that big long post, I laid out a lot of reasoning, and it would have been better to put it in smaller pieces, not only because it'd be easier to remember, but because people will read it and respond to it, and they will direct and help me direct myself, because essentially, I think I have a good idea what the vision is, but it turns out that in that, like in all things, the community is very wise, right? And there's a lot for me to learn and direct. And so basically, I see the vision, it's in one sense leaders articulating it, but it's also the community echoing or not echoing it back, and then and leaders, shaping it. So together we are finding what the vision is and putting it into practice. And I think that's important to see that it goes both ways. It's not just top down. But in this section of the talk, I want to talk about the path to leadership. And this means a lot of things, as we'll see. But basically it's about if there are people who want to contribute and get involved in the community, how can we make sure that it's as easy for them as possible? How can we put as few roadblocks in their way and take whatever energy they have to invest? Can we find a place and a way to channel it so that they're having a good time and are satisfied and the project is making progress, right? And I think this begins sort of at many levels. The most obvious one is something like, how do you help someone who wants to contribute like a patch or a PR? And I think many of us who have experimented with open source projects have probably at some point had the experience of like, I'd like to learn how this works. Let me go clone it. Okay, there's a lot of code here. Maybe I'll look for main, and then main is in a macro, and you can't actually find main, and I don't know. Like, then you say, I'll go play a video game. I don't know, whatever, something else. And it applies to issues, right? So if you have an issue, you can't really read this, but it's talking about something, properly name the exposed memory constant. And the point is, if you have an issue that just says what the problem is, but doesn't give any hints about how to get involved, it's kind of the same scenario. When someone wants to fix this, they have to just find out where in the code to go. And hopefully they know. And actually there's a really great contributor to the compiler who works a lot on diagnostics, Esteban Kuber. And one of the things he told me was the reason he works on diagnostics is because he can go to the issue, find the error message that's not good, and grep through the source and have a place to start, right? And that's just way better than many other issues. But we can solve that problem even if there's no string, right? So this issue is actually by Ali, who's right there. And he didn't stop it here. He kept going, and he gave some instructions on how to fix the problem. He says, we should rename this variable to that, and so forth. And sure enough, just a few days after filing the issue, somebody opened a PR and fixed it. And my experience has been, you can have an issue with no instructions. It will sit there for years easily, and nobody touches it. You put instructions, it will get closed, possibly within hours. It's happened to me. So it really makes a night and day difference, right? And what I'm trying to do now is well, not just me, but what I would like to see happen is to push beyond just instructions in issues. Because often when you write those instructions, what you realize you're doing is essentially documenting the code, right? Explaining a sort of slice of the code. Here's how this part of it works. Here's where you would need to make changes. And some of that you will always have to do, but a lot of it is repetitive. And so I'm trying to extract and build up a document that describes the compiler and gives a guide to how its different parts work, right? If you compare, say, this directory listing of the compiler, which is kind of what you get now, to if you want to get an overview of how it works, to this markdown document with a table of contents, you can already get a feeling for how much more manageable it feels. Even me, who's been working on the compiler for 6 years, when I look at this table of contents, I'm suddenly feel like, oh, yeah, there it is. It's right there. It's all laid out. It makes sense. And so that, I hope we can keep finding new ways to kind of make it easier to get involved, right? But to some extent, this is like conventional wisdom, right? And I don't know if you're actually doing this, but this is how I would react if I were in the audience and someone was telling me what I'm telling you. And I was told last night when we gave a dry run of this talk sort of at the Rust meetup that I have to act this out, so I'm going to do that now. Okay, so it's going to go like, oh, Nico, I don't want to hear this anymore. After all, honestly, I learned a lot of this from people who are in the audience, like Josh Matthews, right, and many other people who write on the internet and so forth. And so, for example, this is the Bugs Ahoy website that Josh and others pioneered, and it helps you find places to contribute to Firefox. And we have similar things like find bugs and so on. But these problems, a lot of this stuff here is actually just kind of the first step, right? It's all oriented at how do I take someone who's kind of interested in contributing and get them to their first PR with the minimum amount of friction. But there's another question of once they've made a PR or maybe a few PRs, how can I keep it enjoyable and keep them engaged, right? And to move on to becoming a sort of regular contributor. And for that, I've been thinking a lot, or we've been working on this kind of working group idea. And the idea is that we have essentially a group that's dedicated to producing two things. First, a piece of code or a goal that they're trying to achieve. And secondly, a community around that, around getting that done. People who know how that code works or people who've helped each other to get it done. And there's a lot of question marks still on just what a working group should be and how it should function. And I think we're all experimenting with different strategies here. But some parts seem clear, right? You want to have like a leader or leaders that are essentially looking for laying out the overall strategies, looking for opportunities to break up tasks into smaller tasks and farm them out, and doing a lot of mentoring and helping people to grow expertise. And the idea is that if you do several PRs in the same area, several different contributions, they're kind of building on one another, right? And you're using the knowledge you had from the previous time to push you on to the next one. We want to have regular meetings so that people can collaborate and have a sort of shared channel that is dedicated to this working group. I found text-based meetings is the best because of language barrier issues, basically, and also just video sync is hard to arrange. But basically, all of this stuff is kind of up in the air, as I said, but the key thing is to make a group that helps one another and that is all working towards a common goal, and it gives people a sort of sense of community and a chance to be part of some feature that is exciting, or a chance to be part of some sort of focused group, a smaller piece of identity that it's easier to get into. So it's essentially like if you think about the compiler as a whole or Firefox as a whole, that might be very intimidating. But if you think about some specific part that is what you work on and you own, that is a very different feeling, right? And that's what we're shooting for. And there are some techniques that have come up, basically like strategies for subdividing tasks out. So for example, a quest issue, if you have a task which is not that hard to do, but it has to be done many, many, many times, you can distribute this relatively easily by writing up some instructions, making up a checklist of all the places it needs to be done, and then kind of putting out a call, right? And it's a great way to get people involved because usually these tasks are like low barrier to entry. They update some test files or fix this formatting issue or something. And it can really sort of be an easy way to advertise out. But other times you have something that is much more complex. And in that case, you might prefer to use sort of like a skeleton approach where you lay out essentially an end-to-end design that kind of works, but has many, many holes, right? It doesn't really handle all the hard cases. And you leave those and try to mentor them out and get people to work on them and fill them in and basically work towards the goal of this thing actually working for real. And along the way, documenting helps and other steps. And this is proven pretty successful. So in the Rust compiler, for example, I think the mirror, which is our new intermediate representation, not so new anymore, still feels new to me. The transition to mirror kind of worked in this way. So we got a vague PR that could handle like hello world, got that landed. That was just sort of me and maybe Eddie, I forget, kind of pushing through. And then from there, people started jumping in. And we didn't really have this idea as formally then. It just happened organically that there were these holes and people wanted to help and they started filling them, right? But it can be a really effective technique. And this stuff starts to apply, I think a key lesson that we have learned is that there are so many more tasks that people want to do and can do that are not writing code. This ranges from things like bisecting regressions, minimizing bug reports, and so on, all the way down to things like scheduling meetings and taking minutes. And one of the problems, I think, that are just around these days is that these tasks are not all necessarily valued equally. And So for example, scheduling a meeting, organizing a doodle poll isn't something you can put on your resume like opening a PR, but it's probably as important or more important to keeping the project moving, right? And it's something that, especially if you're trying to do it many, many times, you could really use help with. So this raises this question, and this part of the talk, I think, is definitely sort of very much a work in progress. Trying to figure out how can we have some ideas, you know, that are well known from Rust and elsewhere on how to get people involved, help them write code or contribute or do whatever task they're trying to do, but how can we distribute this leadership, this top level, the ones who kind of parcel out the tasks or set this up? And I think there's really not a super easy answer here. I mean, some of it is leadership takes a lot of time, and if you have volunteers, they don't necessarily have that time to put in. So maybe helping people to advocate at their jobs for time to work on the project, so forth, is a good strategy, but that's hard to do. Another thing, though, I mean, that's all things we would love to do, but we found that there are some simpler steps you can do that are also effective. One of them is just don't get in the way. As it turns out that actually there are, at least in our experience, there's a lot of leadership potential out there that people don't necessarily know how to contribute, but they have the energy to do it if there's space made for them. So an example I would like to use, or I use a lot, is that I'd say was it 2 years ago, 1 year ago, about this long? Yeah. If you'd asked me then, who is our release and kind of infrastructure management team, I would say, well, that was Alex Crichton. He did all of that. And that's because Alex is an amazing multitasker. He can do a lot of things. But you know, it was tiring for him. And if you ask that same question now, these are our teams, right? We've built up 2 teams of contributors and volunteers, and they're led by, respectively, Simulacrum and Aiden HS, which is their usernames. I have to look at their actual names. Mark Simulacrum and Aiden Hobson Sayers, 2 excellent people. And you know, all of this energy was there, but what was missing was we didn't make the space and say, like, we would like people to help us manage the release and the infrastructure process. We kind of thought that was something nobody would want to do, and therefore Alex had to do it. And it turns out it's an interesting task with a lot of details and a lot of room to improve. And actually our process is much better now than it was, you know, 2 years ago, because we have all these creative people working on it. And we've been doing that kind of across the board. So the Rust team structure started out fairly flat. We had this core team and then a lang and a compiler and docs and libs. There were like 5 teams, I think, maybe 6. But now we've been adding levels and levels, right? So just on this slide, which is not even complete, remotely complete, I have, I don't know, 10 or something. There are lots and lots of teams and working groups, and each one of them has leaders and people involved, right? And by making more levels, more people come because there's more space for them to fill. So this is a really important lesson that we've learned. I think another place where we use this was in the language design area. So the team that kind of makes those decisions traditionally had a pretty simple structure. There was like people who commented on threads and RFCs and stuff, and then there were the members of the team, right? And there were these 2 levels. And some people commented a lot, but and every once in a while someone would join the team, but we didn't have kind of roles in between, formal roles that people could play. And so now we've been working on creating some. So we have, for example, in a given area we might have a meeting, and in that meeting we don't invite just the members of the team. We take the members of the team who care about that area, and we take the people who've been commenting a lot and making insightful comments about that area and bring them together and just focus on that. And it's kind of like an informal sub-team right there, right? Or we have a shepherd role for people who aren't on the team fully, but they're helping to guide conversations, and they join the meetings and kind of participate as equals. And this has been a good way for us to grow the team. I think we could do more of this. But overall, the key point is that we need to make and think about the paths from which people enter the project. And that's not just the first PR, it's not just the second PR, it's kind of all the way as far as they are willing to go, ideally, right? We would like them to go as far as they can in terms of leadership and being involved. And that might not be always the same path. So some people might start by writing code and go from there to organizing and leadership, but there are other people for whom they might go directly to kind of organizing and leadership, right? They don't necessarily have to be someone who writes PRs to help guide language design or to help organize a working group. And I think we know that in sort of companies, you hire managers. You don't necessarily always take a manager or take a person and bring them up through the levels. You might hire a manager directly. But in open source, it's a little trickier, and we're still wrestling around that, I think. So the takeaways basically is that put yourself in the shoes of someone who's contributing. Think about the paths. Turn them ideally from not just cow paths, sort of, but actual roads that are really easy to paddle down. And the more structure you can give, I think, to a certain extent, the better, because people will feel invited to participate. Right? And in particular, think also about going beyond just contributing in code and other ways that people contribute. This has been what's been really helpful for us. So now I'll leave it to Aaron to have the depressing low note at the end. I mean, the things we're still working on.
Yeah. So I think one interesting facet of all of these lessons we've been talking about is they've created new batches of problems that were not even possible before. And they're good problems to have, but they are nonetheless problems. And I think this is one, for those of you involved in the Rust community, this kind of thing will ring true. Like, OK, we've got this great, open, inclusive RFC process where we want to hear everybody's opinion. Well, when it's working, there's a lot of opinions. And it's just a huge amount of work to try to shepherd these discussions, to distill down the details. And I mean, what's amazing to me is most of these threads, all of these hundreds of comments, they're actually, most of them are saying interesting things. It's not just people giving essentially thumbs up, thumbs down. I mean, there's some of that. But it's just a big scalability problem. And I think this is one of the things we're wrestling with the most right now. And it shows up in a few different guises, right? So one of them is RFC threads. And in fact, there's been one of these runaway threads that I've had to step in on this week. So this is definitely not a solved problem. But there are other facets of scaling issues that we don't really have the answers for. I think one thing that's been hard in Rust for a long time is it's such a big project with so many different layers and aspects, tools, ecosystem, and so on. The amount that happens in any given week is more than anyone can keep up with. And so we have layers and layers and layers of ways to help people keep up with this stuff, right? We have a weekly newsletter, This Week in Rust. We have yearly roadmaps and 6-month check-ins and bi-weekly newsletter, you name it. But it's like everything we try to do to cut through all of this noise and sort of say, OK, here's the really most important thing, actually ends up making more noise. And so it can be really hard to make sure that people are hearing the things that matter to them. And we've had some incidents recently where we had a feature that was multiple years in the making, had gone through every phase of the processes we've been talking about, advertised final comment periods and everything, and then it shipped. And then somebody said, why wasn't I consulted at the very end of that? And they actually wrote an RFC to try to unship the feature, which we shut down immediately. And I think it was frustrating because we felt like, OK, we can't possibly be any more transparent about what we're doing. Like there's not, the process itself is maxed out on that front. So the problem is somewhere else. And it's connected to clear communication and status tracking. And I think a lot of this comes back to what Nico was talking about in the last section. When I look at the Rust project as a whole, and I'm trying to figure out what the biggest problems are that we need to tackle, the thing I feel the most is the lack of managerial capacity. And I think part of what makes this hard is to be an effective manager in this space, you have to be deeply technical. You have to know your stuff. But if you're so deeply technical and you're doing this as a volunteer, you're probably going to have a lot better time like doing the technical work, right? It takes a special kind of person to want to do this kind of coordination work in their free time. And they do exist. We're finding them and trying to figure out how to form them. But because of the lack of this kind of contribution, we have a hard time keeping things up to date, clearly communicating, cutting through all this noise, and so we have these scaling problems. So there's kind of a ray of hope. There's this essay that I liked a lot by Michael Rogers about comparing two different perspectives on open source, a maintainer-centric perspective and a community-centric perspective. And you can guess which one Rust falls on. But I think one of the insights in this article is about the problems of successful projects, right? So if your user base, if your community is growing exponentially, the only way to keep up with that is to grow the maintainer group exponentially. And generally speaking, the only effective way to do that is to turn that growing user and community base into the maintainers, into the leaders, right? So you have to sort of feed, make sure that the growth that's causing the problem is also its own solution. And that's why we put so much thought into these leadership pipelines and so on, because it's our only hope. There's no other way we could ever keep up with the amount of growth. But as Nico was saying, this is the sketchiest part. We've added a lot of teams in recent months, and it's definitely helping, but we're not all the way there yet. So certainly this is an area, if any of you have experiences or insights about how to do this, we'd love to hear about it. OK, so I won't spend a great deal more time. So we tried to boil down these lessons into these succinct slogans that you can kind of keep in your head. And we definitely use this as shorthand whenever we're talking about some new thing. We raise like the WWIC, have we made sure that there's enough consultation before we go forward with this? And I guess the last note I'll leave this talk on is the unifying thread for all of these lessons, and I think our approach to the Rust community in general, which is that what leadership needs most is humility. And that's really how the Rust community is structured, that we recognize the fact that clear leadership is important, like there is a role for distinguished leaders, but that the leaders don't have all the answers, and that their most important job is listening. And all of these processes and mechanisms are designed to facilitate that. But at the end of the day, what it really boils down to is that we think people are valuable, and we think they have ideas that we don't, so we want to hear from them.
I just want to add one last note, which is to thank Dave Herman and Yehuda Katz, whose insights and love of acronyms have given rise to a lot of these things. But cool.
Thank you.
Yep. I don't know. I guess we have time for some questions.
No, we're over time, so I don't know who's running the session.
You are?
It's 1:47.
No. Who's giving the next talk? Come on up.
Yeah, I think we're.
Oh, there is an intermittent. Oh, well, then we do have time for questions if there are any.
Yeah. Yes?
So one of the things I have come to believe is that in certain contexts, the value of making any decision can be more important than making the right decision. Just the cost of coming to a good decision is greater than the delta. Would you say the Rust sort of process just sort of rejects that philosophy, or is there some way to integrate that with the public community input process?
So the question was, just for the mic, I guess, whether sometimes there may be value in making a decision even if the best decision isn't apparent, basically. If the difference between them is not big enough, it's good to just move forward. And I guess I don't think I'd thought a lot about it, but I feel like having the teams make a final decision, like basically the rules that we usually use to know when it's time to move forward is when you can lay out the arguments on each side and kind of on balance make a call in some way. And I think it doesn't have to be that there is a clear answer, basically. It's okay to say, both of these seem pretty reasonable, but we decided to go this way. Usually it's good if you can justify it a little better than that. But if it's at the end, it's if the reason is you think it's hard to tell and you're going to try it, that seems okay to me. Basically, if you can make a persuasive case. But I wouldn't say we reject it. I would say it's a little harder in this system to do that, especially not preemptively. But
I think I want to say what you just said actually indicates that we, at the very beginning of the process, agreed with that point and thought that there is a point where you're spinning your wheels and actually doing it.
Yeah.
So I guess I have a slightly different perspective. I think there are two, so I think this is a really important question, and the tension between this drawn-out decision-making process and a need to ship is one of the hardest things that Rust leadership faces. I think there are two things that help mitigate this. One, the community is actually pretty good at recognizing cases that don't matter that much. I mean, even there may be like very heated debate going on or whatever about some particular syntactic choice, but especially if there's no clear consensus emerging, they're pretty okay with the team just sort of stepping in and saying, okay, we just need to make a decision and we're going to go this way. But I think the bigger thing is the roadmap process, because we can set expectations that the roadmap is where we really think as a community about Rust, the product, and what needs to happen with that as a product, and that includes timelines for shipping and so on. And so we can set expectations about we need to have reached a decision by such and such time in the year. And it's delicate. Like if you try to force it and there's not enough buy-in, that you can get into big trouble. But I definitely don't think debates should just be open forever as a matter of course. I think it's really important that you can ship.
There's one other thing I want to add. I think that's really very true what Aaron just said, that like in a sense you're making a value of shipping, right? And pushing on it and saying sometimes that has value in and of itself. But there's one other thing that I think is key that we didn't actually talk a lot about, but I think it's important in our process, which is that it doesn't end with an RFC. And usually when, at least in our system, when you land the RFC, that's like the authorization to begin the work in some sense. But there are decisions along the way, and they have their own process, which is similar. And there's a final stabilization decision at the end. So a lot of times, I think there are decisions where, you know what, it's okay to defer that right now until you have more experience and so on. And that addresses some of these cases at least. And you reach a final decision later. And that's good, actually.
Somewhat related question. In your RFC process, is there a set timeline for an RFC, or do you kind of play it by ear based on how much heat is being generated? When is that final comment period set, and how long is it supposed to be?
Yeah, so there's not like a black and white formula for sure. Oh, sure, repeat the question. Yeah, so the question is basically, are there any sort of formal timelines around the various parts of the RFC process? And the answer is basically no. So the final comment period itself, that is a fixed length of time. It's 10 days. And there are various reasons for that. But, you know, this is to some degree an unsolved problem where people will write excellent RFCs that are like looking way into the future. And I think everybody, including the authors, realizes that this RFC is not an appropriate thing to accept now. And then the question is, well, is it okay for people to talk about it, or is that a distraction? And we go back and forth about this. So I think that one of the ideas we have about trying to improve the scaling issues and so on is to basically narrow the scope of RFCs, or have a more clear delineation of like, these are just discussions and these are like actually in the RFC pipeline, and there's sort of a gate to step into that. So.
Yeah. The actual process, just to answer that, I think you asked what it was, is that we have someone proposes via a special comment that we accept or reject, and they give a summary of the discussions and the key points and arguments for either side. And then there's a checklist of the members of the team, and when enough of them, I think it's all but 3 or something, have checked off that they agree, then we move to the final comment period. And at any point, anyone on the team can raise a blocking objection, at which point we can't move forward until that blocking objection is resolved in one way or another.
Looking at some of the RFCs, I could also look at their time. Not just because of volume, but because of how it's organized by GitHub comments. If you explore alternatives to GitHub issues?
So the question is, have we thought about alternatives to GitHub issues and PRs? And the answer is endlessly. I also find them very dissatisfying, but we haven't yet found an alternative that we find like on balance better, but I think there's definitely room for improvement, especially shifting away from encouraging lots of small, very fast back and forth comments and towards a sort of more deliberative style. So we've experimented in, not for RFCs, but like for the roadmap process with people submitting blog posts, for example, about what they think the priorities for the year should be, and then we read all the blog posts. And this encouraged a different style of authorship, right?
There were 100 blog posts, so
It took a while to read them. That was Aaron's job.
yeah, it was great. But
So it seems like you have a fairly well-defined process that's working out pretty well for Rust. I was wondering if you had thoughts about how well, like, why does it work for Rust, and what would be the obstacles in adapting it to either a smaller project or even just a project like the Mozilla development?
so the question was basically, this seems great for Rust. How adaptable is it to other kinds of projects, bigger or smaller? And I don't think we've thought too deeply about this, to be honest. We're very focused. But I think, certainly the level of bureaucracy that we have now is not appropriate for early stage. But the core themes that we tried to pull out in this talk of why wasn't I consulted, articulate the vision, path to leadership, that's the real heart of this. And I think those ideas apply to any scale of project. And there are lots of ways you can codify them into processes. So one place you can see this happening actually is in Rust libraries in the open source ecosystem. They're part of the Rust community. They're often trying to mimic Rust's processes to some degree. So many of them have some kind of RFC-like process, but it's really boiled down. It's much simpler. But there's still just a very clear, oh, here's a big decision that's coming. We're going to flag this, communicate it out, and give people a clear place to comment on it. So I think like the core ideas are very reusable.
Yes.
Follow up on that idea, and but the open source archetypes paper that was released a while ago, I thought that was really interesting to break down that you mentioned this very early. Open has all these different meanings, right? And so to even figure out like your governance of your project depends on a whole bunch of other things, right? So like Rust being developed and the goals around community and around just how they want to function is pretty different from how Firefox wants to organize. So really taking into account that as to what ideas would make sense here to apply to other type of project.
Yeah, I think we probably have to call it. Although, do you want to take one more?
Yeah, let's take a final
All right,
question.
Emily.
I was about to ask you a very large open-ended question. So I can bring this up later on as well. But you talk a lot about the path to leadership, and I've seen the teams growing over time. What are you thinking about the path out of leadership? Because how do you want to see those kind of transitions on the pieces and stuff go to prevent burnout and keep that turnover restricted?
So the question was about the path out of leadership as well, and that has been on our minds lately, and you had a great post about it. But we've definitely had people transition out, and the usual, what I tell people when they're coming in is basically, I would like you to join the team. You can at any point say, I need a break, and you'll go to alumni status, and you're on alumni status until you choose to come back, and it's kind of up to you, right? And that's a very simple, that's like the first cut. But I think we can do a lot better and need to over time, especially as the teams get bigger. I think it's a good question.
All right, thank you, everybody.